David and Neil are going to talk about reframing the climate conversation. Um, David is a former New Yorker editor as well as Condé Nast and all the magazines that you probably love. David has been involved with them. Neil is the director of Green Economic Transformation at the New York Climate Exchange. Neil also plays the guitar, sitar, and oud in salsa masala and Indian Latin funk fusion band. So check them out. And David is the son of a Moroccan rabbi and a Catholic Iowan. And so I guess he definitely knows a thing or two about reframing conversations. I'll pass it on to you, David.
Yeah, but not a thing about how to play music particularly well. So thanks, Neil. And thank you everyone for having us. And Varun, I really appreciated your talk. It was super informative. I want to kind of shift the conversation a little bit into how do we talk about these things and who do we reach out to? Because I think that uh, you know, it's one thing that we need to do obviously is develop solutions broadly speaking that are going to address the climate crisis. At the same time, we need to make sure that those solutions are just. And I think that the way that we engage our communities and get them to participate in a movement is to listen to them, understand their needs, and engage locally. And so I think one of the things that, obviously we're looking at this hyperpolarized American political climate that does have global implications. And I kind of want to just unpack what lessons are here that maybe we can apply to our everyday lives, maybe into whatever context other folks find themselves in, when this conversation can feel so needlessly politicized. So, to that end, digging right into a kind of policy culture conversation, Neil, I wanted to ask you 78% of the IRA money was allocated to red states despite quite a bit of opposition to the IRA among many Republicans. I mean, you had Marjorie Taylor Greene going out there saying this is terrible, denying the funding, and then within 2 months later saying I've always supported this. This is the most amazing thing that has ever happened without actually calling it the IRA. So can you talk a little bit about why you think the Biden administration took the approach it did and to what effect and what effect do you think the IRA funding has had on the ground in some of these red states with their political constituencies?
Thanks, David. And Amita, thanks so much for having us for this, and Varun for your really excellent opening remarks. Every time I hear you speak, it's a mix of, grounding us in the realities, but providing a really tangible and realistic path forward. So I appreciate that as kind of the opening here. And David, I think your question really dovetails perfectly off of Varun's remarks. I think it was both a political and a strategic tactic of the Biden administration to locate a lot of the IRA money specifically around decarbonization, electrification, manufacturing, both to develop industries that would outlive the administration's own presence, and ideally to build some political buy-in for that work. On the political side, maybe the calculus didn't quite work out. But I was actually really heartened. I was at a conference in North Carolina a few weeks ago of just transportation officials, local, state, private sector actors, some researchers, some civil society groups, and all of them, despite the changing political circumstances, despite the changing their own votes in many cases, were extremely bullish on electrification. I think because they saw that, one, they were making money off of it and they were getting jobs off of it, whether it came to the battery manufacturing in places like Georgia or North Carolina or even Alabama, or just the ability to retrain folks to maintain those vehicles, to produce those vehicles as more of these factories and facilities site there, and also just to develop everything from new grid infrastructure to upgraded infrastructure that these areas needed. I think despite the changing tide, despite the changing climate, there's really a lot of bullishness even in a place like the southeast of the U.S. And I think that, despite the political outcome, I think the strategic outcome in terms of folks being bought into this is just the staying power. It was really visible. And I think the more of this investment happens, the more of this development happens, the more people will realize that there are actually adjacent opportunities to build on top of that. For instance, you have this battery manufacturing ecosystem that's developing in a lot of the Southeast. Out of that also comes battery circularity. What can you do with a electric vehicle battery that's no longer has the capacity to be used as an EV? Can have a secondary life as a battery, as a building energy storage system, or as grid energy storage. And then once it has degraded further than that, can it be recycled for raw materials and plugged back in? And even that third piece of it is probably even more resonant and important because of the trade issues that we're facing, because of the supply chain issues we're facing. And so to be able to recycle materials isn't just kind of this green, sustainable, circular economy play. It's an economic development and business opportunity play that really ought to take advantage of this new electrification ecosystem that's happening there. But that said, even your framing of that point, David, was really important, that so many people that voted against these things are benefiting from these things, including the elected officials that railed against it when they were supposed to vote for it in Congress, but then happily came to the ribbon cuttings. So I wanted to ask you about kind of, specifically leveraging your experience as a journalist, that communication piece. Is there a way that we can take some of that? Is there a way of producing those same outcomes, but maybe communicating them in different ways that resonate in different ways that build that political power and that political constituency for the physical changes that we need to see?
Fantastic question. And the answer is I hope so. I mean, I think there's no magic crystal ball to say exactly what the right set of strategies are. I think that right now we're in a really fertile moment to really figure that out, be more strategic with our focus. And when I was at the magazine with the New Yorker, and then also working at Wired, I think one of the things that I encountered a lot was this tension. It's almost a contradiction between the sort of hope-based narratives, like, hey, like these are things that are happening, they're investments that are happening, and they're generative. Here are solutions that are actually working on the ground, which obviously took up a kind of minority of the stories that we would see, because a lot of the times there's I think an implicit bias within media to say, hey, this is something that we think is really newsworthy, and oftentimes those are framed as threats, which makes sense, right? The administration is going to do XYZ, so we should feel threatened, be aware. That's what we define as being newsworthy. So I think that in the last, I would say 5 or 6 years, there has been a sort of slow shift, and there's some new players on the ground, right? Like there's Heat Map, there's the Grist, folks who understand that there are smarter ways to have climate conversations within a media context. I think now that I've kind of transitioned out of traditional media as just like my full-time thing, I mean, for everyone here, I think I want to be very clear. Big reason why I did that is not because I don't think that media and journalism don't have a really important role to play. They really do. It's that I think that there are, it's just really important for us to figure out how to communicate strategically to specific groups of people who might be left off the table, people who are already sold into climate change. They know that it's happening, they care about it, but maybe they feel defeatist in some kind of way. Jenny Odell has this great line. She's an amazing author. I encourage everyone to go check her out. She has this line about declinism, this idea that that the future is kind of inevitable, and what that future is nothing that anybody wants to kind of be a part of. And so you shut down, you retreat, and it makes sense. It's kind of just like a survival strategy. But what this moment demands is, I think, a different kind of mindset. And so the way that we engage people, the way that we talk to people, and who we're reaching out to demands trust. And a lot of these kind of this media apparatuses, I think, because they become so politicized, their ability to do that with some of these key constituents. And what I mean by that is maybe folks in purple states. What I mean by that is like my uncle who lives in Iowa, who I think I could totally get on board, and I've already seen some glimmers of hope there, right? It's not going to be the New York Times that does that, but maybe I'm a vehicle by which the information of the New York Times, I can use that information, figure out how can I translate this with a sort of 1-2 year horizon, maybe more, so that we can actually have real conversations because I promise you, I think this like gut feeling that like we're never going to be able to convince these people, I just don't think that's true. That may be true for like 20, 30% of people for whatever reason. They just get the messages, and there are some bad faith actors in the media ecosystem, so they're kind of set in. But there's a lot of people that we're just kind of leaving off the table, and there are a lot of people already bought in who just need to be kind of nudged to action. So anyway, I know that we're getting a little bit behind on time. So I just kind of want to, dig into a next question there, which is to you, I'm wondering, as we sort of bridge the gap there, we have partisan media doing partisan things, people becoming, you know, more, let's call it, immune to messages that ultimately they could get inspired by, and maybe compel them to do something interesting, either whether that's with their local politicians or maybe in supporting a local business initiative, whatever it might be. Can you tell me a little bit about how that partisanship has kind of actually played out on the ground with different stakeholder groups? And then as a part of that, I'm just kind of wondering if you can sample how disinformation or misinformation, like what you do when you're confronted with that, when you're actually trying to drive forward a solution.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And actually, I wanted to respond real quickly to a point you made about the types of media and how things are covered. I think, as you said, dooms get clicks, right? Scary stories get clicks. But two things that I really appreciated. One thing was Jigar Shah, the from uh, the recent administration, just said that he approaches every story with a 10-day lens. He'll hear it, but he really won't listen to it until 10 days after. Is that still the headline? Or has it kind of faded away because, it was just something to get those clicks in the short term? And even Vox, I heard that they were changing their climate coverage a little bit to say, all right, they're going to be flooding the zone with different stories that scare us on the climate side with different tidbits here and there. But rather than covering every scary potential message, we're going to wait for and see the effects of those things. And, if there are genuine defunding issues, if there are genuine deregulation or regulatory changes, we will cover those, of course. But we're going to wait until we actually see something rather than just kind of the pronouncement, because very often we can get scared of those scary announcements. But the real tangible impact is a lot different from that. But that said, I think you also raise a really important point about the way that we talk about things. In my last role, I was leading industrial strategy for the city of New York and was working on the city's green economy action plan. And I think that, it was the framing of green, the framing of even climate was super helpful for all of us that were bought into this idea. It was an easy shorthand to say everything from decarbonization to resiliency to advocacy around it and all of that. But the reality is that a lot of the people doing the brass tacks on the ground work do not think of that work as being green. One of my favorite examples here is a welder who is welding a wind turbine does not think she's doing a green job. She thinks she's welding a wind turbine. She could well be welding an oil tank, but she's welding a wind turbine. And her identity as a welder does not change. Surely what she's doing changes, but from the perspective of the brass tacks work that she is doing, the way she thinks of herself and of her identity, it is that. And frankly, in many cases, we have to think about how even just that framing that animates many of us on the kind of pro-climate side of things can itself be very harmful. So I work very closely with a lot of organized labor, and even in their own internal communications, most folks in this world love the work that comes out of decarbonization, love the work that comes out of electrification, love the work that comes out of renewable energy. Don't love the word green because it sounds like, frankly, a whiny liberal. And, so this is a huge constituency that is immediately turned off by just that word. And so even in the internal communications of a lot of organized labor, they don't use the word green to describe these things that we would use as a shorthand. And so I think there's even just the lexicon that we employ, that we choose to describe these things that we, to your point, could all care about and do all care about. I think that's something that we should, that it's maybe in fact a silver lining that we can of this current moment. It can prompt us to rethink some of the words we use, some of the ways we approach these things, and frankly, sometimes the dismissiveness through which we approach it.
I just want to quickly on that, maybe we can just get two more messages before we segue into audience questions, because I really do want to hear from you on what you think. I, when conducting kind of some research here with different stakeholder groups, different audiences, that is the thing, is that there are ways in which people can connect to climate. There might be health issues. There might be, it might be some toxic thing happening in their community, and that gives them a sense of disgust and it mobilizes them that way, right? There's so many different emotions that people can experience, but those structural benefits, right? Like I have this job. I think of it as just my job, but I now am attached to that. I want to protect that. And the people in my community want to protect that too. And so finding the language, all of those are opportunities to actually just connect with people on like the kind of brass tacks. This is a dinner table thing. And that's kind of what's missing right now. I mean, if you look at the data from last year, the 2024 election, you can see the spread of what people trusted Democrats versus Republicans on. And it was like a slight favorability for Republicans, which, by the way, on the economy, which was like the number one issue over and over and over again. I mean, more important than all the other issues by a large margin. And it was a slight, right, like preference for Republicans on the economy. But if you look at like if you look at climate, you'd see that there's actually a big swing in favor of Democrats because we support the climate. So like, what does that tell us? It tells that people don't really understand how this is connected to this, right? And so we need to kind of bridge that gap, and we need people to connect it every day. Americans or people all around the world understand these things as understand climate as also an opportunity, economic opportunity, as a way to execute a vision for the future that is more healthful, that is also more just. And this is how you get people on board with this movement, with this, and with these policies, I think, in the long term, so that we can avoid some of this political whiplash, which is just getting us nowhere.
Your specific point, frankly, your uncle in Iowa, he gets a greater proportion of his electricity from wind and probably broader renewables than we do here in New York.
And you want to know what's crazy about that is that he will then look out at the windmills and be like, but my landscape, but he can be one too, that's the thing, is like even he now 10 years later is turning around on windmills. So it's like, there's lots of, glimmers of hope here. Anyway, so we are almost out of time. So maybe you can just give me one last statement. Like, what is a thing that you think for these folks, one last takeaway that maybe we didn't quite touch on that you want to?
I think just there is so much opportunity here in how we talk about this and frankly how we deliver these things. We were chatting a little bit, just about how there is the narrative piece, but then there's also the lived reality. And I think those need to come together in a stronger way. So one example really close to home in New York is this recent congestion pricing, the congestion charge that's been implemented. Very important. It needs to happen both for the sake of generating new revenue for mass transit, but also for the sake of minimizing congestion and air pollution. The challenge that we here in New York did not learn from places like London, from like Stockholm, from like Singapore that had done this prior, was they gave people alternatives before that pricing came in, before those costs came in. And so this really important policy just meant that I was paying more to do what I wanted to do. I didn't have a better service, that I didn't have a better alternative. And I think even the way that we think about some of sequencing here really should come back to what's the alternative, how can we make this alternative that, to Varun's point, will come with consequences, will come with disruptions? How can we make the alternative seem like the preferred alternative? How about you,
Totally
Debbie?
agree with that. I mean, I think that for me, there are probably three things I think we probably left off the table that are really important to emphasize, which is that the role of people that people trust. Sorry, the role of trusted messengers. So you have people in these communities, faith leaders, but it's also you too, right? And you know, I was at an event yesterday with the Grist, and um, one of the things that they were saying was that you know, I wish we had more philanthropy to digital influencer pipeline. I wish that that was a more robust pipeline. I wish also people understood who influencers are locally, a more kind of expansive sense of influencers, and that both of those are levers that you can pull to kind of get people, sorry, that you can use to get people engaged. And then I think the last little bit of that on that kind of hope and local action, I am someone who was very late to the climate game. I'm going to be totally real with everyone. I was covering lots of different things, you know, mostly big politics background, but also some music in my role at the New Yorker. And I think that just being able to connect with people who are deeply invested in this was inspiring because they saw it as something that they had a positive vision of the future that they wanted to manifest. And I found that to be enviable. I found that to be desirable. And I connected with them on why it is they were doing it and the urgency of the moment. And I think that my next point was like, okay, well, then what do I do with that information? And I lived in that moment for a long time, right? A little bit of climate depression, a little bit of like, okay, but what's my next step? And so I think the thing that I would really encourage folks to do is to also think, is to like just zoom into the people who are right around you who maybe do want to be more involved and to understand what those kind of local actions are that they can do. Because I think there's just a lot more work that we can do locally with our neighbors, with people in our communities to help them all understand to the point of ruins like, you know, climate adaptation and resilience, right? We're going to need to focus on that because I'm with you, like 2.5, 3 degrees. I mean, let's hope that we can rein this in, but we're not going to really be able to do that unless movements also are local, because that's how we get people who don't necessarily totally ideologically agree with us, but we can build up centers of power that then trickle up. So anyway, I think that's kind of like a big thing that I just want everyone to think about. Think locally a little bit more, and also don't leave out the piece where there are some real structural disadvantages here for some of these communities. A lot of the people who are most marginalized would be most affected. So it's like one thing to say, great, we're going to have this kind of all the cake for everyone. But meanwhile, you know, there's going to be many, many, many of us who still suffer from the kind of structural disadvantages that can come with, you know, globalism. So just try to keep that part in mind so we can safeguard those communities as well. Yeah, questions?
Yeah, you know, we're
Out
running
of
a
time?
bit late, but
Yeah.
we have someone who joined from Brussels, Belgium. So I'm going to read out their question, and maybe in 30 seconds, if you guys could weigh in. They're saying totally agree regarding thinking the language we use to talk about climate. Most people don't care, not explicitly at least, about emissions or the planet's temperature, but they care about clean air and health, about sanitation in their cities, about dealing with the flood event. And media/journalists hold an important role in translating and making these links more clear to the average person. Curious to know if you have examples of great climate journalism. And this is Kruti Munot from Belgium. 30 seconds.
Real quick, my
You, Neil.
immediate response, sorry, my just quick immediate response is some of the best and most effective climate journalism that I've seen is not climate journalism. It is automotive journalism. It is utilities journals that are talking about the opportunity within those sectors that are effectively solutions to climate change, but are not frankly targeted in that way. And in many ways, those have the biggest impact on the targeted audience than anything else. A lot of the other things that I've seen.
I completely agree with that. I think that is kind of a point of emphasis. And if you're just curious to sort of engage with other like more long form stories that are very climate focused, I would encourage you to check out Bill McKibben. He's been a huge help to me, and I think has inspired me big time. So yeah, that's what I would say. Thank you everyone for everything.
Thank you so much,
Big
David and
time.
Neil. That was such a
And thank
thought-provoking.
you, Neil.
Appreciate it. Thanks, David. See you.
Thank you so much.